genetically modified foods. They're made from organisms by altering DNA. GMO labeling isn't required in the U.S., despite worries about the potential health risk. A Consumer Reports study out this morning shows the surprising result of testing on cereals, chips, baby formulas, and more. Urvashi Rangan is the magazine's Director of Consumer Safety and Sustainability. Good morning.
Good morning.
So what did your survey find?
Well, we looked at about more than 80 processed foods that contain corn and soy out there. We did about 2 samples of each. It's really a snapshot study, not drawing conclusions about any brand. But here's what we found out. If a product didn't have a claim on it, it was likely to contain GMO corn and soy. And then we looked at a number of other labels that suggested GMOs were not used and sort of put those to the test as well.
So why are GMOs bad for you?
There's a lot of controversy about GMOs. Unfortunately, they're not required to be proven to be safe before they get out on the market. So we're kind of learning that in a backwards direction. There are some concerning animal studies, not enough done in humans. But until then, we know more than 90% of people want to know if GMOs are in their food. And so we think they have a right to know that.
And what do we do with that information? So you tell us it has GMOs and you want us to do what with it?
Well, I think just like if a food is homogenized or made from concentrate or irradiated, those labels are required to be on food. So just like GMOs, we think it follows logic that they should be labeled as well.
And even if it says natural, that still doesn't mean that it doesn't have GMOs in it?
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of definition behind natural. 64% of people in our survey believe that natural means no GMO. And yet, that's not the case. There's very little definition for what natural has to mean. And that's just one of the reasons we've been actually having a campaign to ask consumers and the government to ban the natural label.
But I still don't understand, why can't we find out whether they're good for you or bad for you?
Well, there's not a whole lot of testing that's out there, Charlie. There's not a lot of safety testing required. The government here doesn't mandate that. They do not require that before these things go to market, that they're actually proven to be safe.
But they've been on the market for a long time, haven't they?
They've been on the market for probably the last decade, and they're certainly different enough to get a patent for. And if they're different enough to get a patent for, why aren't they different enough to demonstrate that they're safe?
Okay, if natural doesn't reveal it, what if it says organic?
So natural in the products we tested, almost all that only natural labeled had GMOs. When it came to other claims that were reliable, organic was very, very good. It's a certification program. It legally prohibits the use of GMOs, and that was reliable.
So as someone who does a lot of the grocery shopping, my husband's laughing out loud right now, why shouldn't I buy foods that have GMOs? Is it going to do some GMOs and it's going to do something to my children or to me?
I think it's really about making informed choices and having people decide for themselves. Labeling is required in more than 60 countries by the same companies who fight labeling in this country. And the fact of the matter is it hasn't destroyed GMO production in any other country. People have a right to know whether it's in their foods. They want to know. If people wanted all blue M&Ms, they'd be labeling for blue M&Ms. So just like that, we think people have a right to know if foods are produced with GMOs, and if they're concerned about it, they need to have ways, and there are ways for them to actually avoid that.
All right, and your number is so people can call you. There's more to discuss. Thank you, Urvashi Rangan.
Thank you.
Always good to have you.
Thank God we're going to have them colored M&Ms.
That's right. I was thinking that too. For all of the Consumer Reports findings, go to...
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. I want to thank you so much for coming to our Food Policy for Breakfast seminar series. I want to welcome you to Hunter College here in East Harlem. My name is Charles Plotkin, and I'm the director of the New York City Food Policy Center and a nutrition professor here at Hunter College. I first interviewed Urvashi more than 12 years ago for my syndicated column, The Diet Detective. At that time, she was changing and challenging the food world as a scientist at Consumer Reports, now with the Grace Foundation. Of the more than 400 interviews over the past 20 years as a journalist, Urvashi stands out as one of the most impressive, knowledgeable, and informative. When I took over the director of the center more than 2 years ago, naturally my first call was to Urvashi to give a talk, and she accepted. So she was the first talk that came here 2 years ago just to inform and enlighten us, and I'm pleased to have her back here once again in East Harlem, and she is sick. So it was really exciting that she still came, even though we were scolded because it is a public health hazard. So no shaking hands and no coming too close. I want to really welcome and thank Urvashi for coming here today. I always am entertained and engaged and educated when she's here, and I'm so pleased to have her. Really, I have her here so I could hear her wonderful talk and become educated. So thank you and warm welcome.
Test? Good. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Charles, for that really nice intro. And I remembered watching that piece and thinking I had been throwing up the entire night before I had gone on air. That's why my voice is the same as it is now. It's normally not that raspy. So I guess I'm good at doing these things while sick. But it's really good to be here, and I'm sorry I wouldn't be causing a public health hazard had I known I'd be this sick today, but I didn't want to not be here, and so I'm really glad to be here, so please don't shake my hand, and I'm just going to jump right into it. I prepared kind of some new slides today for anybody who saw the talk 2 years ago, and I've done a lot on labeling, but I've also kind of gotten into a little bit more on ingredients and the GRAS system, and so I'm looking forward to sharing some of that with you and some of the new analysis that we're doing these days around veggie protein and things like that, so looking forward to sharing that with you. A little bit of background. That's what I really like to be doing, and for anyone that lives in New York City, it's underrated, our waterways, and paddleboarding is really fun. So, but other than that, I am an environmental health scientist, toxicologist, and I spent 17 years at Consumer Reports running food safety and sustainability for them. I actually ran product safety in general, thinking of tests for humidifiers, toilet paper, chicken, beef, and we tested loads and loads of different foods, both for bacteria, antibiotic resistance, but we were also always looking at labeling and whether sustainable systems really provided some kind of benefit. For me as a public interest scientist, I was always interested in making sure I could get sample pools where we could look at sustainable samples or more sustainably produced samples compared to conventional to see if there were any notable safety differences. And we were able to demonstrate a lot of those along the way, whether it was beef or chicken, things that were produced organically, or grass-fed, things like that would normally have a better profile when it came to pathogens and multi-drug resistance. After 17 years of doing that, I decided it was time for a career change for me, and I left Consumer Reports in August of 2016, and I had then started to take some consulting work with a number of foundations working on grass-fed baseline principles for beef, and trying to help these funders who were very interested in regenerative pasture-based systems to push that. For anyone who's not familiar with grass feeding or pasture raising, the meat itself actually has a nutritional benefit from 100% grass. It's one of the more interesting sustainable systems where we're actually seeing and can document the nutritive benefit in the final product. Can't really do that with organic right now. It's sort of too broad of a spectrum. In organic, we haven't really lasered in on exactly what you have to be doing to that soil to get that nutritive benefit. But in grass feeding, it's definitely there, and the omega-3/6 ratios are definitely higher. The conjugated linoleic acids are higher. The vitamin profiles are higher. It's, of course, better for the animals, too. It turns out, as they're making all those better fats, cows eating a ruminant diet, which is the diet they're supposed to eat, which is grass, is much better for their digestive health. And in fact, it reduces acidosis in their gut, which turns out is better for keeping E. coli levels down. E. coli really likes an acidic environment, and it's sort of a dirty secret out there that grain feeding in animals really generates an acidic gut, which makes it very conducive for E. coli to form. It was something we were able to show also in one of our beef studies that we did. But again, it's an example of where, in this case, you're looking at it from the front and back, but really when we're better to the animals, they have better health on the farm, they're healthier. Ultimately, we can get a healthier product out of it down the line, whether that means nutrient density per se or less contaminants per se down the line. And I'm a big proponent of that. I do believe that when you look closely at systems scientifically, you can start to demonstrate those things. I more recently became Chief Science Advisor at the Grace Communications Foundation. We're downtown. We fund a number of different progressive food efforts in sustainability. We also run the Meatless Monday campaign. And it's really been a pleasure to work there and have the opportunity to work with so many different partner groups who are all doing great work on this. And so for me, the thrill is just moving to a different place and trying to kind of do the same work along the way. And another part of my job is really to help educate funders. So I'm working within a number of funder networks, trying to make sure that funders also understand that holistic approach when it comes to food and how important that is when it comes to funding, and also the important questions that funders need to be asking before they start putting money in different places. So I live here in the Bronx, and I am a mom of 2 small boys, and I have a garden up there, and like I say, I also plot my paddleboard right at the Spite and Dibble Canal. So before I get started, I want to talk a little bit just about what we think. And at Consumer Reports, we did a number of national surveys, which were always really fun to get a finger on the pulse of where people were at. And when I started 20 years ago, people generally bought healthier food because they thought it was healthier for them, and they were interested in green because it was better for their health. What's really nice to see, not just even in this survey, but in lots of surveys that we see today, is that people care more about other things too. And in this one, you can see that caring about supporting local farmers is actually the top. We were always really surprised by that result. And reducing pesticide exposure obviously has always been important, but supporting fair pay and working conditions, now that's some recognition about a worker and their health and their fairness, or better living conditions for farm animals. And it's really heartening to see this shift because, again, it helps people start to make those connections between what we're doing on the farm, how we're producing our food, and the health of the whole food production system in general. So with that, I want to talk about the natural label a little bit. We had been running a campaign on the natural label, and let's start talking about that. So we had queried people about natural and what they thought it meant. And it was, again, pretty unbelievable to find that nearly 2/3 of people were currently being misled, and that's the dark blue bar, to think that natural meant all of these things: no artificial ingredients, no artificial growth hormones, no GMOs, no antibiotics, if the animals went outdoors. This is on meat. On processed foods, it's kind of a very similar profile. People, almost 2/3 are thinking no pesticides or artificial ingredients or colors. Unfortunately, it really doesn't mean a whole lot of those things. The only thing natural means is, when it comes to meat, that nothing artificial was added to the cut of meat itself. Has nothing to do with how the animal was raised or what it ate or if it went outside or if it had a natural diet. It just doesn't mean any of those things, and yet this is what people think it means. And so we were able to quantify the percentage of people actually being misled and filed a number of complaints with the government.
not that they went too far, but we were able to at least get a lot of that information out there. That's a problem, obviously, because people mistake natural for being organic. In fact, more people look for the natural label than look for the organic label. And organic's not perfect by any stretch, but it is a label with standards behind it and verification. It is much, much more than natural is, and yet more people look for natural than organic. So when we think about the sort of challenge out there in getting people to, one, they know what they want, right? They care about a lot of things, and yet they don't know how to make the right decisions on how to get them. It's really where the market gets shortchanged and we don't get the progress that we want to see. And so really it's up to us to become smarter shoppers and help our friends become smarter shoppers and our families, so that we can start to hem this in and make purchasing decisions that are informed. Now, part of the problem, of course, is just marketing in this country and the fact that you can essentially almost lie and get away with it. And it's a problem. And so again, it's really the onus is on us to be smarter and to know a little bit more than what our market sort of allows in terms of influencing us. So I want to talk a little bit about drug use now. I'm going to talk about sort of a couple different areas and jump around, but drug use, animal raising claims, and consumer expectations. Okay, so I'm going to take you through this slide a little bit. One thing we asked consumers about is what they thought the no antibiotics label actually meant. And about 50% sort of hit it on the nose. They thought no antibiotics were administered to animals. However, 25% of people thought that it meant no antibiotics or any other drug was administered to animals. And 15% only thought it was drugs that are important in human medicine. That's the subject, by the way, of a lot of the corporate pledges you hear today. McDonald's, Wendy's, a number of these groups who are pledging no human antibiotics. And it's important to listen for that because that's not all antibiotics. And resistance is caused by all antibiotics and probably by other things too. So it's tricky. And of course, our government doesn't require you to label if you do use antibiotics. Wouldn't that be novel? And it turns out 84% of people would actually prefer that. If you used an antibiotic, people would like to know that an antibiotic was actually used. But that's not how it works here. You don't have to label that you used antibiotics in anything. And it's up to the consumer, if you don't want that, to find products that explicitly tell you they don't, but in a way that's clear so that you can understand it and make sure you're getting what you want to, what you want. I want to take you through this slide a little bit and talk about where these labels stack up. So this is a complicated slide and I hate it, but I'm sort of, with time, trying to refine it. Start at the bottom here. So the bottom's the market convention, and this is where pretty much everything's allowed. You can feed drugs, you can feed antibiotics on a daily basis to healthy animals, and claims like pasture-raised and free-range and grain-finished and natural and even grass-fed USDA verified, which I did tell you was a good system, but all of these don't guarantee that antibiotics were not given on a daily basis. You cannot rely on any of those to get you there. The FDA came out with something called Guidance 213, which said that they would like it if pharmaceutical companies would not approve drugs for growth promotion purposes, and human antibiotics should not be approved for growth promotion purposes. And that's fine, that kind of went through. It really doesn't seem to have done very much to the numbers. However, they did set that. Now there is a loophole there because antibiotics can be given to animals on a daily basis in the very same way for disease prevention. And so it's pretty interchangeable in terms of that use, and so companies can still do that even while making the claim that they're not using them for growth promoting purposes. So the guidance is fine, it's just a little bit above the baseline. Now, as you start moving up, you might then prohibit all prophylactic use of human antibiotics. Maybe you'd even prohibit all routine uses of all antibiotics. As you start to get there, you start to get to the raised without antibiotics standard that USDA has, which is actually here. And there's a couple of labels like American Humane, which isn't a great animal welfare label, honestly, but at least you get here in terms of what that label means. But the line up there is really what we'd like to see, because unless you deal with the underlying practices of why you use antibiotics every single day in the first place, you aren't getting to the root causes. And the root causes have to do with hygiene, they have to do with space, right? You cram a bunch of animals together and you just create very conducive conditions for disease to spread. You don't manage manure properly. You, again, create great ways for pathogens to prosper, for resistance to breed. And so these labels up here start to deal with the system. They start to deal with the production practices that underlie these. And so when you start to hear corporations making these pledges and sort of trying to pull these threads out, and we don't see the progress you think you'd want to see in terms of the decreased use, that's because we're not getting to that. We're not getting to the systemic approach of actually dealing with the system and better hygiene and space requirements. So those labels up there are the ones that do that, and we'll talk a little bit more about those labels going forward. I'll just highlight a couple on the top there. Food Justice Certified is a really interesting fair trade label that is bolted onto organic. It is the only fair trade label that deals with worker protection. Again, it has to be organic in order for that label to be used. And it's a domestic fair trade label. It's new, it's emerging, and it's a very, very good label. The Regenerative Organic Certified label, which is at the top, is a label you should be looking out for in the next year. This is a label that Rodale is putting out along with Patagonia and Dr. Bronner's. And it will include, organic is the base, but it will also have a social component and a fair trade component, as well as an animal welfare component. And it's really going to be the first label of its kind that marries all three of those areas in a way that's really meaningful and really puts it ahead of the pack in terms of the other labels out there. So that'll be coming out in the next year. So, quiz time. Does anybody know, let's take a guess, how many drugs are approved for use in food animal production? Yeah, who said that? Say it louder. 450. Yeah, 450. 450 drugs are approved. So the Center for Food Safety came out with a really nice report on this, and they were sad because it's not exactly a great PR piece, but it's an amazing report, and it's pretty damning in terms of how many drugs are approved. And not all of those drugs, unfortunately, well, I'm not going to give it away. So tell me, if you saw this on a claim, you saw all those claims on a package, you think you're good in terms of drug use? Maybe? Not? Should be. What might be a problem? Can anyone think of something that could escape this?
If there's drugs in the food that they're eating.
No. There's more drugs. Yeah, go ahead.
Drugs for health promotion and to prevent disease.
Yeah, but those could be antibiotics, which are used to prevent disease as well. I'll tell you, there's a lot of drugs. There's a whole class called beta-adrenergic drugs. I had my beta-adrenergic this morning. They're like asthma drugs. And it's used for feed efficiency, is what they call it. It's also growth promotion, but it's feed efficiency. You can feed the animals less if you give them these drugs. One of these drugs is called ractopamine, and it's really such an insidious drug. It's approved in almost every species. It has the highest animal mortality associated with it. It can kill an entire flock of turkeys pretty easily if you use a little bit too much. They just all have heart attacks and keel over. It causes very rapid heart rate, and it's incredibly precarious for animals. It is not an antibiotic, it is not a hormone, and therefore it can be used in something that would carry all of these labels. And so maybe you would think, okay, I've seen all of these claims and therefore I know I'm getting something that doesn't have any drugs used in it, but you still cannot rely on that because there are these drugs that don't fit these definitions specifically. And that's a challenge. And with 450 approved, you really have to look for more robust systems, more robust certifications in order to make sure that you're actually getting what you want and is really truly meeting that spirit of not using any drugs in the product. So it's not all good. Okay, so now I'm going to jump over to processed foods. And there's so much about processed foods. I mean, one, we know just from a health standpoint, it's better to eat fresh foods versus processed. But something's happening right now where the meat alternative world is really pushing on these replacements. And a lot of these replacements are incredibly highly processed products. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and also give you some other examples of where you may not know what you think you know, even with an ingredient panel on the back. So the first thing I want to talk about, and I know Marion talks a lot about this, is the GRAS system. So it's not about cannabis. It's the generally recognized as safe program. And it's sort of a misnomer. It's the regulation that FDA says that, yeah, we are in charge of food ingredients and making sure they're safe. We make sure they're safe under this program called GRAS, generally recognized as safe. And we allow you, the manufacturer, to make that determination. And you will run the studies, and you will determine whether it is safe. The FDA does not need to review it. The FDA doesn't even need to know, really. They just need to know that you have everything on record, supposedly. The challenge is that even though GRAS was started in 1972 and there was a little more FDA involvement then, in 1997 they replaced it with a voluntary process. And so the company maybe needs to notify them of a GRAS determination, but sometimes they don't even need to let them know that. And they can literally start introducing new food ingredients onto the market at will. And FDA doesn't really have to know very much. And we're starting to see more and more of that with more and more of these new novel foods on the market. And that's a challenge because they are not currently being subject to any real stringent safety tests. Not to mention that, we have a whole history of ingredients that were, say, approved in the 40s and the 50s, which, guess what? We are having questions about those now, too. We even have some filed as probable carcinogens. And the FDA sort of turns a blind eye often, and these things continue in food. So we're going to go through some examples. I'm going to show you that. All right, so all to say that GRAS is a very broken down system. The FDA knows it. They don't quite know what to do. They don't have the resources, and they don't have the staff to really get it done. And They don't even have the right studies to require for safety put in place. They're that behind. They're that antiquated when it comes to trying to figure out what would be a good deck of safety tests that you might want to do for a new food ingredient. And as you can imagine, a GMO ingredient is completely elusive to them, and there is no process right now for overseeing those. And so it all gets lumped into the same group of go ahead and use it, and we'll figure out if there's a problem or not down the line. So the way food ingredients are sort of segmented out, you've got food ingredients, the actual ingredients. You turn the label over, you see it on the panel, those are the ingredients in the food. Are they? Are they all? The other two areas of food ingredients are called food additives. And food additives are treated differently at the FDA. The first one are primary food additives. So colors, all colors are considered artificial by FDA, by the way. Flavors, and both of those, when you see something like a color or a flavor, could be hundreds of ingredients. So flavorings are often dozens and dozens of ingredients, so are colors, but you don't have to know that because they're considered to be confidential business information and they do not have to be disclosed. So it can just say color, it could just say flavor, and that's all they're required to tell you. Preservatives fall under that bank, and so do nitrates. So nitrates are used as curing agents, and curing agents are also considered to be additives. Now, sometimes you have to disclose some of those things, and sometimes you don't. It's the third column where things get a little tricky, and that has to do with secondary food additives. So these are called indirect food additives, or what the FDA doesn't consider to become part of the food itself. And yet, there's sort of endless example after example of where these things do become part of the food. So the first one is packaging liners. We've all heard about bisphenol A, and the epoxy resin that's used in most can liners. They also thought that would never migrate into the food. It turns out it migrates into the food. And yet, FDA didn't have the right regs in place because they never thought it would migrate into food. So that was never considered when it was approved decades ago. It also turns out that those liners are proprietary information too, even proprietary from the FDA. So they could never really get their heads around formulation for can liners, whether it was going to migrate or not, because they didn't know the formulations themselves, because they didn't require to be known of those formulations. And in that way, it's still a mess, and we still don't have very good alternative liners out there. Carbon monoxide is another gas we use in packaging. Do you know what? Anyone? You know what we use it in? We use it in meat, and we use it to keep meat red, so that it's nice, it looks nice and red when you buy it in the store, and it looks nice and fresh. But it actually, what it does is it's sort of like if you were going to kill yourself with carbon monoxide, and it binds to your heme, and you turn completely red. So it's just like that, and it just binds into the heme, and it keeps it red. It's a little bit dangerous, actually, because you can have meat spoil over time, but look-wise, it doesn't look like it's spoiling. And it's a little magic gas that is used all the time. You will never see it on the package. It doesn't have to be labeled, because it was never deemed to be part of the food. It's a packaging agent. That's part of a class of food contact substances. Again, it comes into contact with the food, and it's assumed to release contact with the food. So carcass washes, for example, every chicken is dunked in chlorine. or some type of solution. You will never see that solution listed on the package. Processing aids. So pretty much many of the ingredients that you find, if they're in a processed form, like soy lecithin, has to have been processed with something. Lecithin didn't drop out of the soy, right? And so you needed to get it out of the soy, and the only way you get it out of the soy is by heavy processing. Whenever you want to separate proteins, carbohydrates, fats, any of those segments out of any vegetable, you don't just cut up the vegetable and you've got them all separated. You have to use sulfuric acids or hexane extractions, and that's what is commonly and typically used to process to get most of these ingredients out. You will never see it on the package. They will never tell you that because it's a processing aid, and it was never meant to be an ingredient of the food. That said, people would probably want to know about that and how those ingredients are made. So even though you see this full ingredient panel, you have to be even smarter than the ingredient panel and think about whether those ingredients are actually something that is highly processed to begin with. And by highly processed, I mean chemicals were needed in order to get it out, and that it was a very, very process-laden process to get that ingredient out. Okay, so I went to Whole Foods and I took some pictures. And these are the new Fandango products on the market. I've seen a lot of lectures on this, and pea protein, wow, yay, it's not meat, it doesn't use land. Again, that protein did not just isolate and fall out of the pea. It took a lot to get that protein out of the pea. And it takes a lot of peas to make all of that pea protein. And so it's a factory, basically, that you need with electricity and water and chemicals and plastics and whatever you can think of to start to manufacture that amount of pea protein. Okay. So that's one issue. So whenever you see things like pea protein isolate, soy lecithin, any of those things should be a trigger to say, wait a minute, might a lot have been used? Might there be a lot of things behind that ingredient that were actually used? I find this one really fascinating. So expeller pressed canola oil. Expeller pressed, it's what you think. It's a physical pressing of whatever it is to get the oil. It's the best way to get oil. But it's followed by refined coconut oil, which I love. And refined is not a nice term when it comes to oils. Refined means that likely a chemical was used to extract it. It's likely hexane. So hexane is the petroleum ingredient that is typically used to extract these things. Hexane is a neurotoxin in and of itself. It doesn't mean that it's a neurotoxic problem for us to eat it. The residues aren't like that. But for the people who are working with it and the amount of hexane that is used in making these things, that's the real concern. So the environmental concern, the worker concern. Yeast extract. So I want to talk about yeast extract a little bit. Whenever you see yeast extract, hydrolyzed yeast, any of those things, that's a glutamate. And while it's not MSG in the sense that it's not a synthetic concentrated glutamate, it is still adding glutamates in that way. And so they are trying to enhance the flavor through that yeast extract. And that's what that's used for. Natural flavors only mean they came from a natural substance, but it doesn't mean it was necessarily something you could eat. So I'm going to save that for you for a little bit, just hold on to that. And then cellulose from bamboo. I love this stuff. So many products have cellulose. Cellulose sounds so natural. I mean, but wood pulp and bamboo, we're going to eat this. So, I'm sorry. So just sort of drawing your attention to just a couple of different things in here, again, that are natural, but you would never eat them. And so this notion of plant-based, I like to think, I'd like to see something that said vegetable-based or produce-based versus natural-based. But again, just something to be thinking about whether that's something you're okay with or not when it comes to buying these things. Okay, this is Tofurkey's Deli Slices. I love this. So the ingredients aren't terrible. I mean, they are what they are. There sure are a lot of them to make a piece of turkey. And I'm always sort of marvel at how many ingredients it takes to replace one ingredient. And, you know, they talk about land use and everything that they're minimizing, but I'd love to see the life cycle assessment of making one of these things, too. I don't think we've seen that yet, and I think these guys owe it to us to demonstrate that. But beyond that, I'm circling the bottom here. I'm sorry, this is a dark picture. Onion, celery, calcium lactate. Can somebody tell me what that is? Do you know why those are used? Anyone? Awesome. They're natural nitrating agents. These are not just flavors that they added. These are ways to create the cured flavor in this faux piece of meat. So curing does a lot of things. Curing is an antibacterial that prevents botulism. It's an important step in curing foods. And lots of foods like bacon, you cannot make them and sell them without it being cured. You just can't, because it's just, it's too risky. That said, there's a whole crop of natural nitrating agents that are coming out now and being used. Yet, the chemistry is the same. So it's the same nitrates, nitrosamines, the whole thing, but they are less regulated actually than synthetic nitrates. So on synthetic nitrates, if you cure a meat product, the USDA requires you to test for residues in the end and make sure that you're not exceeding certain residue limits. If you use natural nitrating agents, you don't have to do that. Not only do you not have to do that, but all right, I'm gonna take a sip. The government actually requires that if you use a natural nitrating agent to cure something, that you need to label it as uncured, no nitrates or nitrites added. That's what's required. So they require you to basically lie and say that it is not a cured product and that no nitrates were used. It is absolutely not true. And it is an arcane and terrible standard, and no one should rely on that. If you're concerned about nitrates, be concerned about all nitrates, whether they're synthetic or natural. And as we all know, minimizing amounts of processed cured meats is important for public health. It is no matter what, whether you used a synthetic nitrate or a natural one. Both of those are important. Of course, you can see natural has nothing, to do with it. Okay. So, this just looks so disgusting to me, but I'm sorry for those who eat this bacon product. So again, soy protein is at the top of this thing. Took a lot to get that protein out of the soy. Then you've got soy protein isolate and then soy protein concentrate on top of that. It's a lot of protein going on in there. And then Carrageenan. Does anyone know what Carrageenan is? Yeah. Yeah, it's a seaweed. It's a red seaweed. It's not a seaweed we eat. In fact, you could not eat this seaweed. But it is a seaweed that we extract this carrageenan from and use it as a gum, as a thickener, right? Like xanthan gum or any of the other gums. There's a whole family of gums. Most of them say gum. This one doesn't. degraded, there was a huge war in organic over Carrageenan for years. And I have to say my colleague Charlotte Boulay, who's still at Consumer Reports, led the charge on that, and she won after years. And the industry just wanted to tear Charlotte down. But Carrageenan, when it degrades, it actually becomes a probable carcinogen. And it is actually classified by IARC as a Class 2B carcinogen. Not fully formed Carrageenan, but the degraded Carrageenan. So companies will use this, they'll make their food grade Carrageenan and put it in a food. I mean, do you think none of it degrades? No. But nobody's really in charge of looking at anything. It was really interesting during the organic wars because there was, I believe it was either infant formula or something else with Carrageenan, and the company itself had done the tests and they had found degraded Carrageenan in the final product. After we started sort of raising the flag on this, they took everything down off the website. We couldn't even find that study anymore. They had just taken it off. And it's one of those things that, again, without the money, it's very hard to start to do that kind of testing, to look for it. But I will say that there are concerns about Carrageenan itself, you know, just the bowel issues and irritation and IBS and those types of things, which are hard to prove in a population kind of way, but we know that there are many, many, many reports of it. But beyond that, the degraded form of it is now considered to be a probable carcinogen. Autolyzed yeast extract, just again, it's the same kind of not MSG, MSG, glutamate added in to enhance flavor. I don't know what this product is. I don't, you know, I guess if you really want an alternative to bacon, this is something that maybe we need, but it doesn't seem that way. Okay, my son was looking at this last night with me. He's just like, Mom. So, you know, original crumbles. Okay, so we've got all the protein concentrates, maltodextrin, any dextrins, all those things, those are all corn-based. They usually come from GMO corn stuff. The hydrolyzed soy and corn proteins, same type of thing. What I want to really draw your attention to, though, in this one is caramel color. A couple years ago, or it's 5 years ago or so, we had done a study at Consumer Reports on caramel color. There are 4 types of caramel color, it turns out. In Europe, they actually have to label for each one. Caramel 1, 2, 3, 4. In this country, we don't. We can just stick caramel color on. You could even just stick color. You don't even have to say that. And yet, certain types of caramel color make 4-methyl, oh God, it's going to escape me, 4-MEI anyway is the acronym. And that is also considered by IARC to be a probable carcinogen. So, you know, everyone in if you're sodaing a lot, you know, Coke, it's all, this is what we're talking about. And it's really terrible. And this is an example of something that was approved under GRAS in the 40s and really has not had a proper review and reconsideration ever since then. And it's a problem when you crunch the risk assessment behind it for the amount of sodas that a lot of people can drink. That said, we know caramel color is in a lot of different things. So here it is in this meat crumble, and again, you've got your yeast extract. Again, things that are listed here that you don't necessarily know what are behind them. Okay, I'm not going to go through and read all of these things, but we did an entire month of products that were labeled as natural. Major products, and highlighted why they weren't natural in every single one of them. And we just didn't have to look very far. It was so easy to do this. We could have done 2 months of it. And so lots of products calling themselves natural, even if they, you know, weren't organic or anything else. Here you see they've got soy protein. the natural flavors here. So in this case, a natural flavor can be highly processed. Flavors can also come from bacteria or GMO bacteria. In fact, bacteria play a huge role in the creation of a lot of ingredients. So flavorings can often come from that, and so can gums. So in this particular case, you're not seeing that, but we're going to get to that. Snapple too, just kind of, again, natural flavors don't necessarily mean food grade flavors. This almond milk has gellan gum, which is also a processed gum. Again, any of these carrageenan gums, locust gums, all the gums had to get processed out of the plant. The gum didn't fall out of the plant, and again, required a lot to get there. A lot of the vitamins also that are added into things, they're all synthetic vitamins, which is, I guess, fine, but we all know that vitamin absorption that is indigenous to the food itself is the best way for us to get our nutrition. So whether it says vitamin A or not, if it's added back in there, it's probably got a little less benefit than if it was in there to begin with. So at the end of the day, I'm sorry, the other thing, I guess I didn't have a xanthan gum, but xanthan gum is the one that is actually the slime of a bacteria. And so you incubate all these bacteria that are GMO and you extract the slime out of them. And the slime is the xanthan gum. It's natural, yeah, it's natural. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with some good news and some helpful news because I think it's important that we don't end on, oh my God, what are we going to do? So here are some tips for getting closer to what you want. Know that how animals are raised, what they ate, will never be on the label. And so you cannot look to the label to know that. And you really need to look to more certified labels that have more holistic programs in them that you can know that they accounted for those things. So things like organic, things like animal welfare approved, things like certified grass-fed will all get you there. Flavors and colors can have hundreds of ingredients. It's just one more reason to be avoiding flavorings and colorings, whether they say they're natural or not. And remember, FDA doesn't consider any color to be natural. And so it's something a lot of companies hide behind, and they put it down as color from beets and colors from this. That's fine, but if you're coloring a food, it doesn't really make it a natural food anymore. So, and FDA doesn't consider it to be natural. That said, they don't enforce, so that's why you see the problem on the market. Refined means chemically extracted unless you look closely and they tell you what it's refined with and they tell you what it's extracted with. You should assume it's hexane or some other petroleum-derived ingredient. Looking for expeller pressed is your best bet when it comes to oils in terms of getting something closer to a natural oil. No nitrates doesn't mean no nitrates. It's just ridiculous, but true free range doesn't mean ranging freely, and no antibiotics doesn't mean no drugs. Natural means basically nothing. And, gums are gums, but, ideally you could probably get away with not having any gums in your life and be fine. And we've talked ad nauseum now about all of these ingredients being highly processed. They are. Whether it's veggie protein. I didn't talk about soy heme, but maybe if anyone has that question after that, we can talk about it. That's the Impossible Burger, which I like to say maybe it's too impossible to be true. And at the end of the day, it kind of comes back to the same things we know, which is choosing fresh foods over processed foods and looking for certified labels that mean something. And so, these are examples of labels out there that do mean something and that go above and beyond what they need to in order to provide really a value-added product. Animal welfare approved is the best animal welfare label out there. It's the only one that deals with slaughter and transport as well, which is a hugely stressful period for an animal. Demeter biodynamic, arguably better than organic. They have more stringent standards. You'll only find them at the farmer's market, but we're lucky enough in New York to have a Demeter stall. Hawthorne Valley is that, and that is biodynamic. There's also a lot of biodynamic wine out there that you'll find as well. USDA's organic standards are not perfect, but they are something. And so when I hear people say organic means nothing, I say, no, it doesn't mean nothing. When I hear people say it's not worth anything, I say, no, but it is worth something. And yet there is still improvement to be made in organic. And we can argue whether, hydroponics should be allowed in organic. I don't think they should. But that said, there are a set of rigorous standards around drug use, around pesticide use, farm plans, hygiene, manure management that are all required. And those are all really, really important when it comes to the health and safety of our food production system. The non-GMO label, it grew out of organic not having an actual testing requirement. And while organic should have just gotten their act together and put in a testing requirement for GMOs, the unfortunate part is that a lot of people think now that non-GMO trumps organic or is equated to organic. It's not. So you can find products out there that are non-GMO, but that does not mean that they were raised organically. And it's a little bit disheartening that to see the kind of reliance on that label. Whole Foods is now almost mandating that label for all of its products. And has these goals for 2020. But that said, there's more to it than just non-GMO. There's many more practices that should be taken into consideration. GAP is the animal step program that Whole Foods has. Certified Humane is another decent humane label. They don't deal with transport and slaughter. And while animal welfare approved does not allow confinement, Certified Humane does. They each argue something that I think is valid, which is that ideally you shouldn't have confinement if you're going for the best animal welfare. But that said, so many farms today, right now, are confined systems. So to the degree they can be better, shouldn't they be able to? And I guess I would say for now, I think that that's legitimate. And so Certified Humane definitely adds some value over the baseline, but it's not quite as good as the best animal welfare label out there. Grass-fed. So on grass-fed, I'd be remiss if I didn't say you want to look for certified grass-fed, and that can be through the American Grass-Fed Association. The Animal Welfare Approved label also has a grass-fed program. Food Alliance also has a grass-fed certification program. And now there is organic grass-fed, which is probably one of the best. And Pennsylvania Certified Organic and NOFA New York are two certifiers that are doing that. And you will see more and more organic grass-fed on the market. Organic Valley has gone that way. As well as Maple Hill Creamery here in the Hudson Valley. So kind of moving down the line, you'll find that there are some somewhat meaningful labels that you can rely on, and then there are just the ones that don't mean anything, and we've gone over a lot of these. And don't be fooled, and just because those products may seem cheaper on the market, because they don't have standards behind them or verification, or in this case, no antibiotics used for growth promotion, just isn't that meaningful for some of the reasons we talked about earlier. These aren't claims that you can really rely on. And that's it. Thank you.
So thank you so much. That was incredible. And so I remember it reminded me after listening to you talk of the, I think it was 12 years ago when I first interviewed and I was talking to you on the phone. At the end I said, off the record, can you tell me what I can eat? And, and you gave me like a cheat sheet, a little list that I, make sure you buy, organic chicken and things like that. And I followed your advice to the letter as much as I could. Certainly at restaurants it's difficult and when traveling and other instances. So I have a couple of questions and I probably have about 200 of them, but I'll limit them because I want to get the audience to get some questions because we will end at 10:15 sharp. The first one is Europe versus the US. And I think what spurred that on was the other videotape, which I didn't play, which is also excellent, with you being interviewed by France 24. You talked about that. Could you sort of give us the differences and transparency?
Yeah. I think when I try to sort of talk about the differences between Europe and the United States, I feel like, while again, Europe's not perfect, they have what's called the precautionary principle that sort of anchors their decision-making around a lot of these things. And the precautionary principle is something that, depending on who I'm talking to, I'm either laughed out of the room or, people actually get it. But it is something where, in the face of not having certainty in data, and as a scientist, I always say if we're waiting for absolute certainty, like I'll be dead, my kids will be dead, their kids will be dead, and then we'll know. We'll be certain after that. And so precaution tells you to be smart about it. It's sort of, well, as a scientist, I'm staring at enough concerning evidence to suggest that maybe I should take action, especially where there's an unnecessary risk. And if it's unnecessary, why bother having it till we figure out whether it is a risk? And so things like caramel color, for example, fall under that rubric. Well, Europe just has a more progressive approach when it comes to that. Precaution is something that anchors a lot of their decision making and has over time. And so, for example, Band-Aid solutions like carcass washing at the end of the line for chickens, they didn't do it. And you know what? They had 1 to 2% salmonella rates. We have 10% salmonella rates, and we use these washes. And the only reason Europe's being pressured to use the washes now is because the United States wants to export their chicken there. And yet they don't want it. San Francisco is sort of the European microcosm in some ways because as part of that city's mandate, they have to incorporate precautionary principles. So you're seeing things around cell phone use, for example, and use a headset, take precaution, we don't know, don't put it to your head. Cell phone companies are still suing them over that, but that said, that comes from that principle operating. And it's a very good one to have so that it's about being smart, not about being naive.
Thank you. And then one last thing, you mentioned about urban farming and hydroponics. And I guess my question is, and there's a huge rise in urban farming and urban agriculture, certainly in New York City, and there was something just passed in the city council. And I guess I'm wondering, I always look at it and say, wow, this is great, there's no insecticides, it's all in a clean environment. So what were your thoughts on that, because you mentioned it briefly?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I'd love to test the nutritional profile of hydroponic stuff. If anyone's testing, they should maybe do that. Because I'm not sure you can get to the nutrient density necessarily, but that's hypothesis, so I'll put that aside for now. But what I will say is that there is some really good stuff going on in terms of hydroponics and aquaponics, where you're raising fish and using the waste and recycling the nutrients to fertilize vegetables. And in an urban setting, that can be really amazing, can't it? Because we don't have tons of land here that's clean to farm on. But it's sometimes a matter of what do you call it. And I think there is a compulsion in this country to jam everything under the umbrella of organic. And organic's not a catch-all. organic means something. Organic means that we are building soil health, or at least not depleting it, while we're growing things in a sustainable way in the ground, in the soil. It's about land use. It's about continuous improvement. It's about biodiversity. You simply don't have those things in a hydroponic system. And so what I've said to even the National Organic Standards Board is, hooray for good hydroponics, hooray for clean hydroponics. Call it that. Don't call it organic. Don't mess up what organic is. Don't adulterate what that is just because you want to capitalize on that label. It's not what it is. And just because you want to capture the claim because it sells is not a reason to be able to do it. The new Rodale label will not allow hydroponics, so they will take that one additional step, and any organic product that it starts with will not be able to be hydroponic to begin with.
Great, thank you. So some questions?
My question's about the system and how we facilitate these labels. So like there's a price associated with getting organic certified, and you talk about like the FDA kind of putting the onus through grass for the companies to do it. But in order to do this research and promote this level of transparency, there needs to be like funding coming from somewhere to pay for the research and the science behind it. Like how do we create a system where things don't become cost prohibitive, but we promote transparency?
So that's a good question. I want to maybe separate some things. So there is certification on something like organic, and that is something a farmer has to pay for to get certified to add that value. It comes with a premium on the market because it costs more to make it organically. Can there be savings in there and economies of scale? There can be, and over time, they do come down over time. If anyone buys organic in season, it's cheaper than out of season, right? Just like even regular conventional. That said, on the other side with the grass, so it's sort of the flip side of making sure our food is safe. It's kind of the bottom, not the top, but the bottom. Why don't we have these things in place? I think that when consumers start putting pressure on companies, that is when we start to see the response. Sometimes it just means they'll take it out. They'll just take the ingredient out and not bother. Because it costs a lot of money to study whether something is safe or not. But how come the burden isn't for the company to prove it's safe first before it goes on the market? And so that's the logical question we just keep coming back to is, isn't it your burden to prove it's safe, not our burden to prove it's unsafe? And that's what our government should be doing. It's called the Food and Drug Administration because that's supposed to be their job. And the problem is that our government spends far too much time protecting companies, protecting these actions, protecting the fact that they didn't do anything, because liability-wise, it's sort of better for them to keep that stance. But that said, the more educated we can become about things, I think the better. And the more we can call out companies directly, especially, I would say now, in this political climate where regulations won't move very much, I say it's time for the market to hold the market accountable. So the smarter we get, companies will listen because it's your dollar. And at the end of the day, that's what matters most to them.
Okay, I'm wondering if fish can be regarded as USDA organic, and if not, why? And what should we be looking for?
Yeah, thank you. So we were talking a little bit this morning, and right now there is no legitimate organic fish on this market. The reason for that is because a fish is not a cow in water, and it was very hard to port the organic standards and superimpose them onto fish. And so many of those in the fish industry wanted the label, and there were examples, for example, shrimp, where we import so much and you can grow them in closed systems, you can control the inputs and the outputs. It was ripe for organic. And then the salmon industry came into the picture, and they railroaded the entire process. They wanted open net pens in the ocean, and they didn't want to have to feed 100% organic feed to the salmon. And a number of groups at the time, including us and Food and Water Watch, lobbied strongly against that because it was so antithetical to any other organism that would be raised under organic. And the salmon industry is kind of vicious. We got a lot of Alaskan salmon fishermen and women to come and testify to the USDA to say this is garbage. We don't need anyone chucking an organic label on farmed salmon. It certainly wouldn't mean more than wild, and it doesn't. And so we don't think it should be allowed. As a result, these standards have not gone into effect. We helped pass along California, actually, that prohibits the sale of organic fish in California, and that was 10 years ago. I think that still stands until the feds come up with standards. And they're back at it again. I maybe like to hope that with the regulations not going anywhere in the next few years, maybe nothing will go anywhere with that. And it was one of those things, again, we thought, do it right or don't do it. But don't do it halfway and allow some subpar organic product out on the market. So when it comes to fish, don't rely on organic. That's not the place to rely. But check out that Monterey Bay seafood cart. It's one of the best things we have out there right now. They're looking at contaminants as well as slavery now. I think they've just come up with that for some social stuff. And then also the overfishing sustainability rating as well. And so that is kind of the best way to get to the fish and what fish you should be eating. But it isn't buy organic. Thanks for asking that.
Hi, thanks Urvashi for a very interesting talk. Here in our nutrition program, we have students take food science classes, and I've got some questions that I'm going to have them look into. So for instance, you mentioned about the carbon monoxide, and I'm going to have some students research that in terms of myoglobin and oxymyoglobin. For me, it doesn't make sense, but I will have them research some of these things. We also have our students learn, that they need to get to the scientific basis. So for instance, things like the B or high protein isolates should not be alarming. There is a centrifugal force where we take a slurry from grains and we can separate the starches beautifully from the proteins. So there is nothing wrong in learning the science behind how some of these technologies are performed. I also tell students that the food supply in the United States is really one of the safest in the world. And yes, there is a long way to go, but it is not all gloom and it's not as bad. It is much worse in many other countries. But it's nice for them to hear both sides and then to find the literature, to find the evidence, and to be able to back things up as well. What I would like, Charles, is for one debate with a food technologist, perhaps, on stage. And, it's good to see both sides of the picture. And this is what we encourage our students to not be afraid, again, of technology per se. Yes, of course, fresh is the best. But again, to see, what is the origin of the technology. Pasteurization, for instance, when it started about 100 years ago, was, they felt that all the milk that had gone bad and sour was going to be put into the system. But pasteurization has helped. So not all technologies are bad. We need them to understand the basics We need them to understand what is the basics of food irradiation. Those kinds of things are also important, and we want our students, when they go out as registered dietitians, to be well aware of the scientific basis also. But there were some very interesting points. One quick question, you mentioned something about natural versus organic, and that people are more kind of open to purchasing natural. Is it because of the cost difference? Can you tell us? Is organic much more expensive than something that is labeled natural?
Probably because it has a lot more standards. It has standards and verification behind it, and natural doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so companies, I think, recognize that, and they capitalize it by using a natural label to basically get somewhat of a premium, but to cheat a product that's really doing it all the way. But I'd like to take a moment just to respond to a couple of things that you said, and I appreciate that, and the role of technology. And as a scientist, I want to be respectful of science because it's incredibly important. I will say, though, that there are lots of questions as students go forward in looking at things that go beyond nutrition and they go beyond safety. They go to sustainability. And so, do we need pea protein to replace animal protein is a scientific question that has many layers to it. In terms of isolation, technology isn't technology. And there are physical things like pasteurization, which are thermal, and there are other things like irradiation, where it takes 10,000 chest x-rays to irradiate one hamburger. So I'll ask you where you want these solutions to be and whether they're appropriate at that point in time, and that those questions also need to be asked in any scientific assessment. I would argue that irradiation is a Band-Aid solution at the end of the line, and that we don't even have hygiene standards for the farm. And so we want to clean up this mess at the end of the line. You will exceed your ability to clean it up if that is what you rely on at the end of the line. And so to me, you've hot-dogged to a highly technical answer when you haven't actually done the fundamental rudimentary solution to begin with. And so you can study anything myopically and think, seems to be fine, pea protein seems fine. But when you put it in the context of what it really is, on the scale that people are asking for it, or on the application of what it is, those are the really more value-based questions as well you have to ask, is it appropriate? And as someone who's been staring at this for over 20 years, I can tell you more often than not, high technology, to me, has not been the solution. It doesn't mean technology doesn't have a role, but I also don't think that all technology is created equal, nor should it be considered to be equal. And I think that in some ways, you have to look at things individually, but you also have to put them into context of how they're applied. So just to put that in as well, I think that's also really important.
Well, thank you very much. That was great. Thank you, Urvashi, and thanks for coming here today. We appreciate you. We appreciate your time, and we thank you. Just want to make a few announcements. Please make sure you check out nycfoodpolicy.org and make sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter to find out about our other events. Our next food policy breakfast event will be on March 20th, and will be at Hunter's Roosevelt House on 65th off Madison. It's health by default, a legalization of better health. And I won't put Mary Nessel on the spot, but we are going to invite her, and hopefully she'll come. I know she's retired. And then we're back in East Harlem on April 17th, featuring Allison Arbery, the food reporter for NPR's Morning Edition, All Things Considered. So thank you very much, and have a great month.